Croeso nôl, pawb. Diolch am ddod nôl mor gynnar. I ni'n symud ymlaen yn nawr i'r sesiwn 3 ar yr agenda, and there is an opportunity for us to confer on our next steps. Before you, there is a substantive motion which we will debate, but there are also a number of significant amendments to that motion which need to be dealt with separately. So my invitation to the meeting is that we deal with those amendments in committee stage before returning to the substantive motion. So my invitation to the governing body is to agree that the governing body do go into committee to deal with those amendments. And as we do that, standing orders will no longer apply. Could I ask for your support for that? If you're willing, would you please show? Are there any who oppose that? Thank you very much. That is overwhelming. In order to deal with the committee stage, we need to appoint a chair. My recommendation is that His Honour Judge Andrew Keyser, QC, acts as a committee chair. Are you happy to support that suggestion? Again, thank you very much. That is passed. I will vacate the chair and ask His Honour Judge Andrew to come forward to deal with committee stage.
Good, thank you. Well, members now sit not as governing body itself, but as the committee of governing body. The purpose of committee is to review the text of the bill and consider proposed amendments, and to present the bill in its amended form for final consideration by governing body itself. Once the bill is returned to governing body, there can be no further amendments, and governing body will simply be asked to debate and vote upon the bill in its final form as remitted by the committee. As Bishop Andy has said, standing orders do not apply to committee stage. Voting in committee is by simple majority of the entire committee. There is no voting by order, and motions are passed by, as I say, a simple majority. There are no formal time limits to speeches. I encourage people to keep what they have to say as short as possible and to confine what they say to the amendment that is under consideration at the material time. If I feel that speeches are taking up too much time, then I shall take steps, including imposing time limits as I think appropriate. Members have the report of the Select Committee. It will be convenient, please, for you all to have that in front of you to refer to it. In Appendix 2 to the report, which is at page 25, the Select Committee has suggested an order of business for committee stage, and I propose to proceed in accordance with that suggested order of business. The Select Committee itself proposes in the report 41 amendments, which are explained at pages 2 to 10 of the report and are shown conveniently at pages 12 to 24 of the report. The screens, I'm told, will not show the text of the proposed amendments, but will simply refer to the amendments by number. So please cross-refer to the text in the Select Committee's report. at a later stage of the business, we shall consider some further proposed amendments, three of which will be proposed by the Select Committee. They're typographical matters that have come to attention since the report, but we'll come to that in due course. The amendments are, as you see, colour-coded. Those in green are minor typographical or grammatical or the like amendments, and it will be proposed in due course that they be considered en bloc. They're numbers 1 and 4 to 31. And then there are amendments of a slightly more substantive form, which are yellow, and they'll be dealt with after we've considered the green amendments. So with that brief introduction, I shall call on the Chair of Select Committee, the Venerable Mike Comer, to introduce the committee's report.
Good morning. I'd like to begin this introduction firstly by thanking my fellow members of the Select Committee for all the work that they put into the process leading to the production of the report. Most of these were people that I didn't know previously. Most of these are people whom still I haven't met in person, as inevitably over the course of this last 6 months when we were working on this, our meetings took place online. But it was a privilege to work alongside them. Special thanks also to John Richfield and Matthew Chinnery from the provincial staff, who were both extremely helpful in assisting us in our work, and without whom I believe we would have struggled to end up with what you have in front of you now. Members of governing body will recall that the function of a select committee in bill procedure is very narrowly defined. The tasks for the select committee are firstly to decide whether or not a particular bill should be deemed to be as non-controversial, and then also to consider whether any amendments that are suggested add to the effectiveness of the bill or increase the likelihood of it being passed, or indeed the contrary, or the corollary of that. So the personal views of each member of the Select Committee about whether or not the particular bill is desirable and should be passed aren't taken into consideration at all. They don't form any part of our process. You'll probably guess from the sheer number of amendments that we wish to consider today that we went through many, many revisions during the production of the report. I counted on my computer at least a dozen, and in the course of time, yet more typos in particular become apparent. I guess that's inevitable. Most of our amendments, as has been mentioned, do concern typographical errors or other stylistic corrections and so on, but there are some of a slightly more substantial nature also. Could I apologize in connection with these typos that one of the suggestions made by the Reverend Naomi Starkey in her written submission, we thought that had made it into our list of amendments. For some reason it didn't, so that will be included in the additional amendments that, with the leave of the chair, we'll suggest a little later in the process. It will be immediately obvious to everyone here from the amount of time that's been allocated in this governing body to this debate that, firstly, the Select Committee did not consider that this was a matter that should be deemed non-controversial. So we probably need to place that on record. So then, to deal with the amendments themselves, and during what follows there'll be references to page numbers. This could be slightly confusing as the report itself contains page numbers at the bottom of each sheet of paper. And then when you come to the draft liturgy, that also has page numbers at the top of each page. So when I make reference to a page number, it'll always be to the number at the bottom of the sheet of paper, not the page number relating to the liturgy itself. So as has been already outlined, the first thing we'd like to do is to propose a procedural motion to deal with the great majority of those typos and grammatical, stylistic errors and so on. And this procedural motion is that Amendment 1 and then 4 to 31 inclusive should be voted together on as a single set, as a single amendment. This will do away with the need to deal with each of those separately. So, the Select Committee recommends the adoption of this procedural motion, if this is the right thing to do, that Amendment 1 and 431 are taken together.
Thank you. I'll formally second the procedural motion from the Chair. It'll be helpful at this stage, before giving opportunity to anyone else who wishes to speak, if I ask the Bishop of St. Asaph to comment on the procedural motion on behalf of the bench. I ought to, in the interest of openness, to confess that I told him I would let him speak first if he promised to sign a copy of his book. He agreed, but unfortunately did not rise to the obvious bait of offering me a free copy.
Chair, members of governing body, Gregory Cameron, Bishop of St. Asaph, ex officio. Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to respond on behalf of the bench of bishops. We're enormously grateful for the work that the Select Committee did on the right. It had been twice through SLAC, the Standing Liturgical Advisory Commission, and twice through the bench, and yet somehow typos will always get through. It is the view of the bench that on both the green amendments, which are largely typographical, and the yellow amendments, which are sometimes of more substance, that as a bench we do not wish to oppose or in any way object to those amendments. They go towards the production of an experimental rite, and we're very happy to accept everything from amendments 1 to 41 that has been suggested by the Select Committee.
Does anyone else wish to speak to the procedural motion? In that case, please would those in favour of the procedural motion show now. And any against? Thank you very much.
Thank you. The amendments proposed by the Reverend Amos Starkey on page 2 of the report, most of her other suggestions have been incorporated into the amendments already discussed. The third submission that we received was that from the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Wright. Beg your pardon.
Sorry, it might be convenient at this point that we go on to formally consider amendments 1 and 4 to 31. So if you could propose that those amendments be approved.
Apologies indeed. So yes, indeed, we would like to propose that those amendments 1 and 4 to 31 inclusive, the typographical main, are accepted.
Does anyone wish to speak to that proposal? In that case, would those in favour please show? Any against? Thank you very much. That's carried. And now we have to run through the yellow amendments, which begin with number 2.
So this is on page 5 of your report. And Amendment 2 relates to the use of language in the original proposed right, or there was talk of same gender, and we felt that in this day and age, same sex was a more appropriate term to use. It seems to be a term that's in more common usage and is likely to be less objectionable to some people than same gender relationships. Therefore, we'd like to propose.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to speak to that? Then those in favour? Any against? Thank you. That's carried. Amendment 3, please.
This relates to the preamble to the bill, which makes reference there to a fee that should be taken by the clergy in relation to such a service being used. Schedules of fees for pastoral offices are, of course, set by the governing body, but we couldn't think of any other occasion when mention of fees was incorporated into the bill. And therefore, for the sake of consistency, our recommendation was that that paragraph be deleted from the bill.
Does anyone wish to speak to that? Then those in favour? Those against? Thank you, that's carried. Number 32, please.
So we turn now to page 9. And you'll also see that from about page 12 onwards, or page 13 onwards, you can see some of these amendments in line with the text, so to speak, to give an idea of context. So this one is to offer people the option of entering together, or not, as it may be. In the original rubric, the suggestion was that they should come in together. And we thought that people ought to be offered the option rather than being told that they had to. I suppose this ties in very much with what we've already heard this morning about the life events and giving people the option to have a say in how they want their services to go. So we'd like to make that an optional rubric.
Does anyone wish to speak to that amendment? Then those in favour, please. Those against? One against, I think. Thank you. That's carried. Then the next one, please.
33. Just a slight change of language, in a sense making it a little more inclusive. Love is God's way rather than love is his way. We just felt that added a little measure of clarity at the bottom of the introduction A.
Does anyone wish to speak to it? Then those in favour? Those against? Thank you. That's carried.
35 relates to the readings that couples might want incorporated into their services, and we felt it would be useful to introduce a measure of, perhaps this sounds a bit contrary to what I was saying about allowing couples to design their own services up to a point, but to possibly restrict the number of non-biblical, non-scriptural readings. So a reading, a single reading, rather than possibility of multiple readings.
Does anyone wish to speak? Then those in favour? Those against? Thank you. 4, I think, against.
We've omitted number 34.
We have. I was never very good at maths. Apologies for that.
Thank you, Father.
This was a stylistic thing. We felt that to add in whom, again, it might find it helpful to look it up on page 15, Almighty God, from whom all good things and in whom all loving relationships have their being. We felt that had a a slightly better flow to it than leaving the in whom out.
Does anyone wish to speak? All in favour? All against? Thank you. That's carried. Number 36, please.
The sentence as it stood originally we felt could be taken slightly ambiguously, so we've just moved part of the sentence around to make it, we hope, a little bit clearer than as originally presented.
Does anyone wish to speak? Then those in favour? Those against? Thank you. Carried. Number 37, please.
Number 37, we felt the original text makes certain presumptions about who will be attending such a service. And so we wanted, again, just to make that a little more optional, to acknowledge the fact that it's possible it might be just the priest and the couple.
Does anyone wish to speak to that? Then those in favour? Those against? Thank you. That's carried. Number 38.
This was the amendment that we probably spend longest amount of time discussing, as it came to us, as you know, from the Standing Liturgical Advisory Committee. It contained this redux of Psalm 16, printed on the left-hand column at the bottom of page 18. We could certainly see the value of incorporating that text into such a service, but we felt quite strongly that while we wanted to leave it there, we also wanted to provide the option of a more traditional translation of Psalm 16. And our recommendation was that it be from the New Revised Standard Version. And so our recommendation is that we print both of those renditions of Psalm 16 side by side with the option of using either.
Does anyone wish to speak to that? Then those in favour? Those against? One against, I think. Thank you. That's carried. Number 39.
39, this one appears at the top of page 21. And again, we had quite a discussion about this. In her submission, the Reverend Naomi Starkey suggested that unknown future was a tautology. We felt that wasn't strictly true. I mean, certain futures are known. The well-known quote about death and taxes, for example, are ones we can all rely on, I'm sure. But for different reasons, we would want to recommend the removal of that word unknown. To talk about an unknown future in the context of prayers just seems to add a slightly pessimistic, dark note to what should be a joyous occasion.
Does anyone wish to speak to that? Then those in favour? Those against? One against. Thank you. Number 40, please.
Number 40, this one again relates to certain assumptions that might be made in the original text. We pray for the church community to which these people belong. They may well not belong to the church community, and so to alter the text in the way presented there gives you the option of praying for that community to which they belong, or if they don't belong to a church, then we're praying for the wider church.
Does anyone wish to speak to that? Then those in favour? Those against? Thank you. It's carried. And number 41, please.
And along the same lines, the original text, bless their home. You can add any children's names. Well, why not have the option of adding the names of other members of the families as well?
Does anybody wish to speak to that? Then those in favour and those against? Thank you. That's carried. And that concludes the proposals in the Select Committee's report.
Thank you.
There is, I think, at least one amendment that is likely to flow consequentially from the amendments that have been made. I shall take some advice on that. We'll come to that in due course. There are further amendments that will, later in the order of business, be proposed.
I think the Select Chair was going to speak about Jonathan Wright's amendment before you moved on. I don't know whether he still does, because he's sitting now.
Well, it's all right, he can speak later. We'll come to those later, together with some further amendments that do not arise out of those that have been passed, but have been notified to me, and there are 4 that have been notified for which I shall give consent. There may be another 1 or more that I shall think about. At this point in the order of business on page 25, we come to item 3, which is an amendment received in time but not supported by Select Committee. It's an amendment proposed by the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Wright. The text of the amendment is found at page 26. You'll see the crossing out and underlining at the bottom half of the page. And the written representations in support of it are at pages 27 to 34. Before I invite Dr. Wright to speak to the proposal, I shall make a few remarks concerning it by way really of a shot across the bows. Left to my own rather nuclear devices, I should simply have ruled this an inadmissible amendment, and I'll explain why in a moment. More pacific and maybe wiser counsel prevails, and I shan't do that. I shall allow the amendment to be put. But I have concerns about the amendment, which are, in a nutshell, that it touches on the fundamental point of the bill and therefore raises matters that are properly to be considered by governing body in full meeting, that is, after we come out of committee stage, and not in committee itself. I've had a couple of very helpful chats, at least I think they were helpful, with Jonathan, Dr. Wright, and it explained my position and what I shall say before he has the opportunity to expand on his position. But can I say this about the amendment? If I may say so, the points that Dr. Wright raises are entirely legitimate points and points that governing body will want to consider. The merits of them will be things that members will have to consider. And the amendment is, if I may say so, raised in a constructive spirit. But the function of committee is to revise and, it may be, improve the text of a bill. And that may involve amendments that are unwelcome to the backers of the bill. That's fine. But the bill does set out the parameters for the consideration of committee. So, for example, an amendment that raised a matter that had nothing whatsoever to do with the subject matter of the bill would be inadmissible, not because there was anything intrinsically wrong with what was being suggested, but just because it was irrelevant to the bill. Similarly, amendments that negative the bill or that are inconsistent with the fundamental purpose of the bill would normally be considered inadmissible because they're points that arise for debate on the bill. Now, the bill proposes to introduce a service for experimental use for 5 years from the 1st of October 2021. The position of the backers of the bill, as appears from the explanatory memorandum, is essentially, to shorten it greatly, that there are important questions that might fall to be considered in the future, in particular concerning the Church's doctrine of marriage, but that there is a present need for pastoral reasons to address the matter of provision by way of a service of what I shall call in shorthand same-sex blessing. And so the bill proposes effectively immediately implementing such a service on an experimental basis for a 5-year term. In his written representations, Dr. Green says that the course taken by the bishops is a grave error. That's what he says at page 27. He says that the bill ought not to have been brought forward at this time. That's at page 28. He says that the bishops have failed to provide a theological justification for the bill. That's at pages 30 to 33. And he says that matters ought instead to be considered holistically, that is, in the context of a consideration of the Church's doctrine of marriage. That's at page 34. Now, all of those points are, if I may say so, entirely legitimate, and members of governing body will have to consider whether or not they have merit. But they are points that go to the fundamental point of the bill. And one can see that by the amendment at page 26, which, as well as removing the second recital, would, in what is shown as clause 4, delete the period of first, or the starting point of 1st of October, and substitute text beginning once the teaching of the Church has been formally changed with respect to the nature of marriage. The fundamental problem with that is that it simply undermines the basic purpose of the bill. Instead of introducing a service of blessing now, it would purport to introduce it at such time, if ever, as the Church passed a bill, which hasn't been presented and doesn't exist, to change its doctrine of marriage. That's not merely a matter of timing. It's a matter that amounts to saying that the service will come into effect only when the Church passes another bill bringing it into effect. You can see that, incidentally, by looking at the point from a different angle. And with this, I'll draw to a close, that Dr. Wright says that the Church should look at the matter holistically. That isn't, in fact, the effect of the amendment that he proposes, because the effect of the amendment that he proposes would be that automatically, upon the Church passing a bill changing its doctrine of marriage, the service of same-sex blessing would forthwith come into effect. Now, what that means is that the Church that passed the service of same-sex blessing would not be the governing body that passed the bill to do with same-sex marriage would not be asked to consider the service of same-sex blessing. That would be an automatic consequence. So that's not looking at things holistically. The answer to that, of course, is that the Church, considering a bill for same-sex marriage, could, if it wanted, pass any other bill or a bill in any other form, including one that approved this service of same-sex blessing, or a different service of same-sex blessing, or no service of same-sex blessing. But once one has pointed that out, which is the way it would be dealt with holistically, one sees that, in fact, what the amendment seeks to do is to kick off the question of a service of same-sex blessing to a later governing body at a future hypothetical time, and thereby, in fact, to bring about what was the first part of Dr. Wright's submissions, which is that to encourage the bishops, who again did not take the bait, not to bring forward the bill at this point, but the bishops have brought forward the bill, whether for good or ill is a matter for governing body, and therefore we have the bill to consider. Now, that is why, in the first place, I should not have considered this a proper amendment, and why I think Select Committee were right not to approve it. It also highlights the danger that a discussion of the proposed amendment will turn into a debate on the merits of the bill. And that is something that, to the best of my ability, I shall prevent, because otherwise we shall end up having either a debate in the wrong place, namely in committee, or two debates. And so, after Dr. Wright has proposed the amendment, I shall do my best to limit what anybody has to say to simple questions of timing and scheduling. I don't think that is a line that can easily be drawn, but I shall draw it as best I can. So with that rather long shot across the bows, I shall invite Dr. Wright to propose his amendment.
Jonathan Wright, elected cleric, Swansea and Brecon. Chair, members of governing body, brothers and sisters in Christ. Thank you firstly to His Honour for his gracious allowance of this amendment to be put and for my continued legal education. The proposed amendment addresses fatal flaws within the bill as it currently stands. I have set out succinctly the argument behind what I will say in my letter to the Select Committee. And if you have not read this, I invite you to use the time remaining to ignore what I'm saying now and to read what is set out on pages 27 to 34 of this report to the Select Committee. What I am proposing has received a wide range of support, including from those gay and lesbian Christians who've been in contact with me. I hope this amendment will provide a have your cake and eat it option that the majority of governing body can support. To pass this right, but recognise that same-sex marriage and blessing should only be introduced together. You may wish at a further point to address some of the Chair's concerns when it reaches the bill stage after committee stage. Let me begin briefly by setting out the three flaws this amendment addresses. First, a sacramental argument. The main difference between a civil marriage and holy matrimony celebrated sacramentally within the Church is the blessing of the union by the Church. When the Church blesses a civil marriage, it makes it functionally the same as what is entered into through holy matrimony. Indeed, the very same prayer of blessing is used for holy matrimony as for the blessing of a civil marriage in the 2010 Marriage Services Book. Whilst we are discussing the introduction of a right for same-sex blessing, we are not also considering same-sex marriage. The bishops have stated that time and provision for a careful theological consideration of cases for and against to make a mature and informed decision is needed before same-sex marriage could be introduced. But there is no sacramental distinction between the blessing given in holy matrimony and the blessing of a civil marriage. The bill, as it stands, proposes an illogical and false division. And rather like Brexit, it's not done till it's all done. My amendment keeps same-sex marriage and blessing linked. Secondly, an ecclesiological argument. The Church in Wales is a province of the Anglican Communion, which has duties and responsibilities with other provinces. the Anglican Communion has not come to a mind yet with regard to affirming same-sex relationships. This will be a key item on the conference at next summer's Lambeth Conference. The implications of passing this bill would be to see the Church in Wales suspended from the Anglican Communion, and this has not been made clear in any of the literature produced so far. There is no reference either to any ecumenical dialogue and how this bill would impact on our ecumenical relationships. What my amendment allows is for the Church in Wales to proceed in an informed way, maintaining communion with the rest of the Anglican Communion. It would be presumptuous to organise any rite until at least after the next Lambeth Conference. Yet this amendment makes clear our commitment to consider same-sex marriage. Thirdly, a theological argument. The explanatory memorandum published by the Bench of Bishops must be seen as integral to the bill. It provides the only published teaching to support the bill. So it must be, if not watertight, then theologically defensible. As I have clearly demonstrated in my letter, all the bench have done is to propose a factually wrong, falsely restrictive interpretation of a single Greek word, appeal to unspecified social, scientific and psychological studies, and then call for a reinterrogation of sources. This short, barely 2-page document is not a silver bullet, and it will not convince outside the Church in Wales. Porneia is not the only issue, and we need resources that allow all positions to study Scripture together in rich, thick ways, which deal with the array of issues that need to be considered. The explanatory memorandum stands in stark contrast to what has been published by the Church of England and other denominations. This amendment would allow the opportunity for good resources to be produced that will facilitate a good end result, namely, one that allows all of us to keep reading the same Scripture together, breaking bread around the same altar. Finally, passing this bill as it stands would have 2 other consequences that we should bear in mind. First, it allows for the issue of same-sex marriage to be kicked down the road. The bench rightly say that more work needs to be done before same-sex marriage is introduced. But has that even begun? Almost a year after this was first published. I do not believe the Doctrine Commission has been instructed. If the 2014 documents are to serve as the basis for further discussion, why are we not considering same-sex marriage now? The 2014 papers need, at the very least, refreshment and expansion in the light of recent developments. This amendment keeps the pressure on the bench, and if I may say, on this governing body, to concentrate on producing or commending good, rich resources that a bill dealing with same-sex marriage can be brought forward as a priority. Secondly, passing this bill in its present form would permanently change the situation on the ground, entrench positions, and thus make the future more, not less confrontational. Once approved, it is pastorally unimaginable to think that an experimental rite for same-sex blessing could ever be removed. It would make it much more difficult to have a good discussion on same-sex marriage and blessing together. This amendment keeps the dialogue open. I'm grateful for your attention and for the consideration you'll give this amendment.
Good. Thank you very much, Dr. Wright.
Thank you, Chair.
I'll now put this motion of amendment open to anybody who wishes to speak. Would anybody who does so please come forward and remember to identify yourselves by name and diocese. Yes, Bishop. You're at the front of the queue.
Thank you, Chair, members of Governing Body. Cherry Van, Bishop of Monmouth. I stand to ask Governing Body to resist this amendment, not least because, as has been explained, it doesn't amend the bill before us. It completely undermines the essence of it. 3 years ago, the Governing Body indicated that it is pastorally unsustainable for the Church to make no formal provision for those in same-sex relationships. If this amendment is passed, then this will remain the case for the foreseeable future, until, as the amendment has it, the teaching of the Church has been formally changed on marriage. The Church has already lost people in same-sex relationships because we, as a Church, are deemed to have turned our backs on them. There are already some lay and ordained hanging on by their fingertips because there is no formal way of coming alongside couples in same-sex relationships, never mind celebrating and affirming their relationships with them in prayer and blessing. If this amendment is passed, the cry will go up, "How long, O Lord, how long?" And there will be a huge pastoral and missional opportunity lost for at least another generation. Is that really what we want? There is a deep longing amongst many who are in a civil partnership or a same-sex marriage to bring their relationship before God for his blessing through the prayers of the Church. Who are we to continue to deny that? There's a profound longing amongst many clergy to be able to support and affirm couples who come to them, who want to welcome them and celebrate their love for one another with them. Do we really want to make them have to say, "Sorry, you'll have to wait a bit longer"? Sisters and brothers in Christ, we have a bill before us that is the fruit of 3 years' careful and prayerful work. Let us address ourselves to that as it stands and vote as the Spirit leads us, whichever way that might be. But please, let us not kick it into the long grass by passing this amendment. For there are many in and certainly outside the Church who will not forgive us if we do. Thank you.
Gosh, I can finally see you. Chair, members of Governing Body, Richard Wood, elected Bangor Diocese. I'm very grateful to the Chair for highlighting his concerns about this amendment. Those comments were very well considered. I am grateful, however, that it has been allowed and can now be considered on merit rather than just on its procedural value. The reason I'm glad it's been allowed is that I do actually believe that this amendment strengthens the bill, in that it strengthens the resultant service of blessing, which it would seek to permit, by strengthening the way in which the Church would be able to adopt it. There are clearly very valid questions, which will come up later, as to what the allowing of this liturgy says about what the Church in Wales believes it is doing when it enacts it. Today, we are going to damage and scar people in this room and more widely in the Church. That is going to happen however we decide on the bill in its final form. Either way that vote goes, there will be hurt, there will be damage. If we are going to do that, I truly believe that we should do it once and for the best and full reason. And so I support this amendment in that it seeks to make the main thing the main thing. The main question that we are seeking to answer becomes the main question, rather than another question to be considered later and to bring further hurt. I don't want this amendment to seek to kick the question into the long grass. I don't want it to wait another generation before it is considered. I hope that this amendment will encourage us to bring that main question before us, which is going to damage us and hurt us, but which we must address sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Henry Shepherd, lay elected Llandaff. I support this amendment and I agree that it strengthens the bill. I think it would strengthen the bill to delay things. 15 years ago today, my wife and I were between our civil wedding and our blessing, and the Life Resources event this morning really touched me. The blessing took place in the USA, whereas our civil wedding was in Scotland. And at the time, I'd never been to the USA. I'd never attended a church service in a Presbyterian church, let alone the particular Presbyterian church where our marriage was to be blessed. And yet, the minister who blessed us took every care to make me very welcome. He met with my wife and I every week for maybe 6 weeks. I think, however, that it would have felt pastorally wrong for him to say that he would not have been prepared to have legally done the wedding itself. I think that that would have seemed wrong and inconsistent to me. So I agree that the doctrine should be changed before this rite is accepted. Thank you.
The Chair, I'll take this off, and members of governing body. What I have to say is shorter and probably less profound, but maybe more straightforward.
Name and diocese.
Oh, sorry, yes. Jonathan Sadler, co-opted lay member, under 30s. And so I would like to support the proposed amendment. It seems to me that the bill as proposed is perhaps maybe a political move, but it looks as though it looks as though it is attempting to please as many people as possible rather than seeking to please God. Quite simply, if same-sex marriage is pleasing to God, then the Church in Wales should be performing same-sex marriages, and the proposed blessings are giving same-sex partnerships a lesser status than they deserve. If same-sex marriage is not pleasing to God, then the Church in Wales should not seek to bless it, as it is encouraging sin. These half measures are seen as offensive to many same-sex partnered people who feel they are being sold short, while still remaining unacceptable to many who hold to the Church's historical view of marriage. The bill as it stands tries to please as many people as possible, but actually isolates many directly affected by it. I believe that this amendment forces us to attempt to seek God's will, rather than settling to find man's.
Reverend Naomi Starkey, elected cleric from Bangor Diocese, chair, members of governing body. I'd like to urge people to reject this amendment for the following reasons: that whenever there is a process of change, surely step by step is better than taking one great big leap into a future which may or may not be unknown. Basically, in all matter of debates where there have been major changes in the life of the church, I think particularly of the votes to bring women into ordained ministry in the first place, there's been a long, long process. There have been many, many steps along the way. In my own work as a ministry area leader, I see firsthand how the bigger the change, the better it is to take small steps or maybe medium steps. So I see that there's no problem in seeing this, discussing this bill, as one of those small to medium steps that we have to take. The idea of saving it all up for one great big massive change, I think, is actually far harder when you're talking of a change that will be of great significance to the church and to the church's standing within the Anglican Communion. So I'd say please vote against accepting this amendment, and let's have the full debate. Thank you.
Hello, Andrew Sims, Diocese of Llandaff, lay elected, bench of bishops, brothers and sisters in Christ. The church has a lovely way of saying no. It has a wordy, lengthy way to try and confuse you into believing that in actual fact you're kind of getting what you want, but are you getting what you want? But no. This bill unnerves me and it saddens me. I feel that what we've heard in support of it have been wordy, lengthy, apologetic ways of saying still no. No to you, no to your kind of people. We do not want to go there, and this is just a way of stopping that conversation moving forward. There is something of Sir Humphrey Appleby about it. We have decided that it is pastorally unsustainable to make no further provision for people in committed same-sex relationships. That means that we are duty-bound to do something. And so I would urge you to reject this bill so that we can start to move forward in a more positive way.
Chair and members of governing body, Helen Franklin, a lay elected member from Bangor Diocese. I simply want to pick up from Bishop Cherry's helpful remark about how many people are hurting and feel left out, but to ask the reverse question. And the reason I would support the amendment is to buy some time, simply because I suspect that otherwise on the 1st of October, a number of members in our church now will wake up and realise that something has been done that they knew nothing about. I'm not sure that most people in our churches realise how far we are on in this discussion, and therefore I would ask governing body to consider a way of delaying that we don't just ostracise people by a quick move. Yes, it may delay for others, but it may ostracise the majority or a large proportion of our congregations. Thank you.
Miriam Beecroft, elected Bangor Diocese. Dear Vicar, please may we be married in your church, me and my same-sex partner. We don't mean just a blessing, we mean actually get married in church. It's important to us because of our faith. Dear couple, I'm really sorry that at the moment this isn't possible, but in the next few years it could be. If we accept this amendment today, we've got the ball rolling, we've started talking about the elephant in the room, and we've got a service ready to use once we have gone through the process of establishing what we really believe together as a family of the Church in Wales, marriage is. But if we reject this amendment, we are still very confused, and we are still going about things in a very odd, illogical order. I encourage us to go with Jonathan's amendment and to continue our discussions, not in a few years' time, but at the next meeting and the next meeting, thrash it out so that we can stay united as a church who can accommodate different positions, but remain in loving communion with each other.
Chair, Your Grace, Reverend Phil Bettinson, St. Asaph, how much time is more time? I've been on this governing body on and off for 10 years. We've been discussing it for 10 years. How much longer do we have to wait? The doctor talked about a lack of theology. However, first off, there is no currently central source where we could go as the Church in Wales to gather our theology together. There is no Church of Wales journal. However, when I was in training 10 years ago, every one of us wrote an essay around the theology of same-sex blessing. We have done that theology. We have done it, we have shared it at parish level, at diocesan level, at provincial level. If 10 years is not long enough, then how much more time do we need? How many more people do we need to lose while this amendment holds us sitting on our hands? The governing body does not work in a way that means that this could come back next session or the session after or the session after. If we
put this amendment forward, it will be 3 or 4 years before he even gets timetable to talk about again. In that time, how many people are we as a church going to stand up and say, I'm sorry, we don't accept you? How many more friends do I have to lose to suicide because my denomination actually wants to turn around and tell them they are not a proper person? No more time. This amendment shouldn't be here. We shouldn't be doing it. Let's vote against it and get on with this bill. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, bench of bishops, colleagues, friends, brothers and sisters. Monis Farah, co-opted Diocese of St. David's. It worries me when we do things step by step, especially if the destination hasn't been agreed already. There is an assumption that there is an agreed destination without actually opening up the discussion and reaching a conclusion that that destination is agreed, approved, and is the right way to keep us as one body. An assumption of agreement never fulfills relationship needs and strength, including those who are hurting. I don't think Jonathan's bill is speaking about postponing indefinitely. I don't think that Jonathan's bill is speaking about delays techniques for us to deal with this. If I heard him right, and if I read it right, it's taking us back, I think, to Resolution 110. It's taking us back to a place of where we need to agree with the rest of the Anglican communion and not move in a direction that is separate than the rest of the communion that we belong to. If I read it right and hear it right, he wants to keep the totality of our conversation focused. That halfway measure is not good for anybody. And I think the blessings leads us to a place which is a halfway measure. And people who receive a halfway measure always will feel cheated. I know I would feel cheated with a halfway measure. Like Miriam, if somebody comes to me and asks me whether we can offer the marriage, I will say, no, I can't, but we can offer you a blessing. I wonder how they would respond, especially if they are non-church goers. We hardly can actually understand marriage in society today, let alone a blessing of something that society has already approved of. I have been driving in our community and I've seen a sign outside one of our churches, and I know the sentiments that come from it absolutely fully. The sign, the banner outside a couple of buildings, church buildings in our community says, "Let us bless you." And every time I read it, I have to be honest with you, I feel a cringe rises up within me. Who are we to bless people? We don't bless people. It's God who blesses. And I've been a priest for 34 years. I love the church to the core of my being. I recognize that it is Father who blesses us and blesses everybody, whether the church approves or not. Our God is a generous God. He's a loving God. And in the delay, we are not just coming into a foregone conclusion without the proper theological discussion. And I hear what the previous speaker has spoken about. I don't think we discussed it theologically in our churches, in our communities, in our church councils, in our clerical setups of our diocese. I remember being in England, and you will get fed up with me keep mentioning, harking back on my time for 16 years in England, from 1998 to 2014. We discussed it and discussed it and discussed it. And we had groups of people who belong to the different groupings and different values of the church. I was in Chelmsford Diocese. I don't know what other dioceses have done. And in that debate, we began to hear one another. We engaged with one another. And so we kept moving in a path that's not going to rip us apart and not always make us vulnerable to culture and society at the outside, on the outside of the church belonging. I support Jonathan's amendment for the reason is it doesn't get us to a place of foregone conclusion that within the debate that we go into for a marriage, full marriage within the church, that actually locks us into having to respond back and say, I'm sorry, we did bless you, but we reached a conclusion that we cannot go any further. I think it will be important for us to do the work up front. It's always cheaper, by the way. If you pay up front, it's always cheaper. And even when we're fooled into buying interest-free, the interest has already been calculated into the price of the item that you're paying for. It is always more expensive when we pay later. So I really ask of you to support this amendment. And thank you for listening.
Okay. Can I just point out, before anyone else speaks, that the question whether blessing is a good thing, a bad thing, or a sensible thing, or a meaningful thing, is not one that arises at this stage, because Dr. Wright's amendment proposes the adoption of the same service of blessing. He simply defers its taking effect until some later hypothetical date. So please can people try to address the issue rather than wider questions.
Thank you. Peter Ratcliffe, elected St David's, Chair, Your Grace, members of governing body. On the timing, I rise to support the amendment. We have Lambeth 22 taking place next year, where the Anglican Communion will be debating, I assume, this issue. And my concern is that the Anglican Communion stays united on this issue, and we stay united. And I see Dr. Wright's amendment actually as a way of keeping both sides of this debate united for now, and then having a proper debate after Lambeth 2022 on marriage. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair, members of the governing body, Matthew Hill, elected St David's Diocese. If the Honourable Andrew Kaiser would stop me if I intrude upon doing exactly what he doesn't want us to do, which is to have one debate and then have another debate. But I'm hoping in what I can say, we can get away from this notion of steps and getting too hung up on steps. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to say something about epistemology, how we know what we know. So, the way that's current in our society is something called foundationalism and representationalism. That means that in order to know a thing, it's meant that you have to have a model of it in your head. You get hung up on definitions. There's a much older way of epistemology, which Wittgensteinians would call grammar. Theologians like John Milbank would refer to as identity, which is we know what we know by how we relate to it. So if we relate to something as a marriage, it is a marriage. And so on. But the reason we need to get away from thinking of steps, God was always Trinity long before the Niceo-Constantinopolitan settlement defined that for the church, 300 years or so after that debate had begun. The church proclaims Jesus as the Word incarnate from the beginning. The definitions come after. So you can see the relationship comes first in the church's worship and prayer and discernment. It identifies Jesus not just as a prophet or a teacher, but as God incarnate. And that leads it on to then identify God as Trinity. The definitions come after the recognition. So I propose that I want to reject this amendment because I want us to get away from thinking of this in terms of steps and thinking it more in terms of how the church came to apprehend God as Trinity, which is a process of gradual apprehension of that which is already, rather than simply taking steps towards something in the sense of creating something that is novel. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, governing body, Marianne Osborne, St David's Diocese also. We have a lot to say today. Just really, I want to step away from the heavy-duty theology just for a second, okay? Because I can't stand where Matthew stands. He's much more clever than I am. But I want to feel my way through the sentiment that I want to bring to you. I have 3 grown-up children who have been brought up in the church. They're now 22, 23, and 28. And none of them have kept going to church. And the reason that they don't come to church, and the reason I think that we need to reject this bill, is because the world and the church are so far apart. That chasm between what the world is doing and what we are doing as the church here in Wales, here in the UK, is just so far apart. My children don't see any issue with somebody that is different because their sexuality is different. They don't treat them in any other different way. And actually, if we pull it back to the bare bones of what Jesus came to do, he came to love. And we don't stand here in judgment of the people that are around us. As the church, we stand here to love them, to support them, because that's what Jesus would be doing. And I urge you to oppose this bill, because we need to realign with the world.
Do you mean to oppose the amendment?
Thank you very much. Sorry. I think my legs started moving before my brain had engaged, and I found myself at the front. But what I want to say to you folks is this, is at each of our diocesan events, we have concerns about the amount of young people that are coming into the church, people under the age of 50. And I think one of the reasons that they're not coming into the church is because they cannot find an affinity in who we have not become. And I say that, double analogy, but I say that they can't find an affinity. For my children, people around them, they take them at face value. They love them for who they are and are loved in return. And I think the question of making this move forward, it's not a question, it's something that we need to do. Otherwise, our church as we know it is going to die. Because people are going to see us not as people of integrity, but people who make choices about other people. And the only judgment that should come is judgment from God himself. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Your Honour, members of committee, Stephen Kirk, Diocese of Llandaff, elected. I am one of those who is disappointed that this bill isn't to allow same-sex marriage in church, something which my own parochial church council said they would be very happy to see. But the bill does allow for a blessing. If you accept this amendment, just think about what the church is saying to the world. It is going to say that we believe that God might bless same-sex couples sometime in the future, but he won't bless them now. And that's not something that I'm prepared to vote for. So please reject this amendment.
As the queue has dwindled and as it's lunchtime, I'll draw the debate on this to a close. Exercising the privilege of a chair of committee, I'll say that after all of that, the basic point still remains that whether the bishops should or should not have brought forward this bill, whether it's a good bill or a bad bill, the basic objection to the amendment remains that it would scupper the bill. And that in itself is the proper reason for rejecting the amendment. I invite you to vote, please. Would those in favour of the amendment please show? Could we have a count, please? Please keep holding your cards up while the count takes place.
How long? Till when are we breaking for lunch? 3/4 when there are, so people could be back at 20 past.
20 past.
That's slightly shorter, but 20 past.
So that'll be 20 past 1.
20 past. Okay, we're good to move to the against.
And those against the amendment, please. Sorry?
And abstentions.
Do we have any abstentions, please? Thank you. Thank you. The votes are as follows. In favour of the amendment 27, against the amendment 77. There were no abstentions, so the amendment fails. We'll break there for lunch. After lunch, we shall resume with items 4 to 6 on the suggested order of business, which I hope will not take us any great length of time. Please, would you be back in your seats and ready to start by 1:20 p.m.